Hello?
Hello. Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Most of the people that we were expecting have poured into the room. Thank you so much for coming. All right. So my name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this rather unusual format of a lecture. Because of all the coronavirus precautions, USC has canceled all events for the next couple of weeks. So we moved this lecture online, and we appreciate all of you coming and being a part of our inaugural online lecture and being a part of this experiment. Thank you for your patience with the technology. Just a few notes, technical notes about this format. So we're going to manage the noise in the room by muting and unmuting people during the discussion portion of the lecture. During the lecture, we're going to mute everybody and we're going to take everybody off of video. But when the discussion section starts, then you're welcome to resume your video and we'll control the audio. So you can, if you've never used Zoom before, you can find the meeting controls and the controls for your video and audio settings at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may need to scroll or move your mouse around to get the little bar to show up. And you can click on the chat button to bring up the chat, which might be a way for you to indicate during the discussion section if you have questions or if you want to get our attention. That's the place to do it. Okay, so welcome to our lecture for the 2019-2020 Margie and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellow, Maël Le Noc, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, a few words about the fellowship. So the Margie and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellowship was actually the first endowed fellowship at the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it was endowed to support the research of a PhD candidate to come to USC and work with the testimonies in the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, as well as other resources, related resources on campus. So we want to start the lecture by thanking Doug and Margie Greenberg, not only for the original endowment of this fellowship and the important work that has resulted from it, but also for their constant and ongoing support of the center. We really appreciate it. So thank you to them. If we were in person, we would all be applauding together. They are such an integral part of what we do at the center. So thanks to both of them. So Maël Le Noc is the 6th Greenberg Research Fellow that we've had at the center. He is a PhD candidate in geography at Texas State University. He earned his undergraduate degrees in history and geography from the University of Rennes 2. I'm sure there's a more eloquent way of saying that in French, in France. He received his MS in geography from Texas State University. There he wrote his thesis on family arrests and separation during the Holocaust in Italy. And for that work, he was awarded the Outstanding Master's Thesis Awards in Digital Scholarship by the Conference of Southern Graduate Schools. Maël is already very familiar to the center and part of the center's network through his collaboration and affiliation with the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, an transdisciplinary research group that has visited the center several times. And Maël was a presenter at the center's 2017 International Conference, Digital Approaches to Genocide Studies. And the videos for that conference are available on the center's website if you are curious to go and see what Maël presented about there. His research focuses on spatial aspects of the Holocaust, and the working title of his dissertation is Towards a Geography of Persecution, the Case of the Arts-et-Métiers and the Enfants-Rouges quarters of the 3rd arrondissement of Paris, from 1940 to 1946. He cooperates with several transdisciplinary research groups, as I mentioned, including the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. And we're so delighted to have had him for a month as a research fellow at the center. And we are excited to hear his research presented to us now. Before I turn things over to him, I just want to thank everyone for coming from all over the world. We were so excited to be able to open this lecture up to our global community. And so thank all of you for coming from all of the time zones that you have come from. So Maël, I'm going to pass things over to you.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Martha, for introducing me. Before I start, I also want to thank everyone at the center for hosting me for these past 4 weeks. And also thank the donors, Margie and Douglas Greenberg, for making that fellowship possible. Well, let's see how that works. I'm trying just to change the slides, but there is so many. There we go. So as Martha said, the title of my presentation is Geographies of Persecution in Occupied Paris, Place and Space in Survivors' Testimony. And so today I'm going to talk about my research and specifically about what I've been doing here at the center for the past month. As Martha said, and as the title of my presentation indicates, I am a geographer. So you're going to see quite a few maps, but you might be wondering, what does geography has to do with the Holocaust? So I wanted to start with that quote from a Jewish journalist whose name is Jacques Bielinki, who wrote in his diary in 1941. He was in France, and he wrote, in Belleville, which is one of the neighborhoods in Paris, the street, Rue de la Représentation, very Jewish and usually very lively, is dead today. Stores closed, a Jewish baker has its window broken, desolation everywhere. And so with that quote, I wanted to start showing how the Holocaust can affect the geography, can affect the places where people live, their streets, their very neighborhoods. Tim Cole said and wrote that the Holocaust was not only something that happened at particular times and in particular places, but that it was also a place-making event, which created new places and reworked familiar places. And I would add that it's also an event that destroyed some places, and we're going to explore some of that today. Now, I'm not the first person who's been looking at the geography of the Holocaust. There is, in fact, quite a few people in the past 15 years who've been looking at different aspects of how space interact with the Holocaust. You have people like Paolo Giaccaria and Claudio Minca, who looked a lot at conceptualization of space by the German, the idea of the Lebensraum, the vital space that was supposed to be free from Jews for the Germans, or how urban planning has been working under the Third Reich. You have other people such as Annos, Tim Cole, and Alberto Giordano, who took a much more quantitative approach to try to see how did the Holocaust transform spaces at different scale. For instance, how does the system of the camp transform spaces at the European scale, at the continental scale? How does the building of ghetto work at the scale of the city? How does the pattern of arrest works at the scale of the country? All of that. And sort of a third branch has been using testimonies in part to look at the places of the Holocaust. And so Tim Cole wrote that book called Holocaust Landscapes, in which he looks at specific places such as the ghetto and how people experience the ghetto, the camp, but also places that you might not associate necessarily with the Holocaust, such as the road or the train or the forest where Jews were able to hide. Now, most of this work has been focusing on iconic places of the Holocaust, and mostly places in the East. They've been looking at camps, they've been looking at ghettos. But in France, for instance, there is no ghettos. There was no ghettos, right? People were arrested at some point at home, but that means that the first stages of the genocide happened at home, in their streets and in their neighborhoods, before being arrested and then sent to camps in the East. And so the questions are, how does anti-Jewish persecution transform these neighborhoods? How does it transform the population makeup? How does it transform their daily lives, the daily lives of the Jewish inhabitants, their special practices and their special experience? How does it transform their relationship with their neighbors? And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do, answering all of these questions, or at least some of these questions. And I'm trying to do so by focusing on two quarters of Paris, which are in the north part of this third arrondissement, the two neighborhoods that are in red on that map, and they are called the Arts-et-Métiers and Enfants-Rouges. So first, why am I looking at these two quarters? Well, the very first reason is because there are unique archives pertaining to these two quarters that do not exist anywhere else in Paris or in France, actually. There were a lot of archives produced by the French police and by the German police during the early stages of the persecution. In France, since the French Revolution, it was forbidden to do censuses related to race or religion. When people were being put on the census, race and religion was never a category that was put in there. And so before starting persecution, the police needed to know who was Jewish and who was not. And so in 1940, they started doing a racial census, and by racial census, what they really do is they are putting out a law asking everyone to go to their local police station to register as a Jew. All the Jewish families, the head of the Jewish families, have to go to the police station to register as a Jew. And then later on, they keep doing things similar, who leaves traces behind. For instance, at some point in 41, all the Jewish neighborhoods, all of the Jewish households have to give up their radio, they bring it to the police station, they sign papers. In 1942, they have to go to the police station to pick up the yellow star. And so all of these archives kind of help having a trace of what was the population, the Jewish population throughout the war, throughout persecution, and how it evolves. Now, those archives have been destroyed after the war for multiple reasons, but the thing is, it's been destroyed everywhere in Paris except in those two neighborhoods. The one police station that was over the Arts-et-Métiers and Enfants-Rouges quarters did not destroy the archives, and we don't really know why, but that makes these neighborhoods really particular. This is the only place in Paris where you can really trace and get a good sense of what was the Jewish population throughout the war and how it evolved. You can see who's there, who leaves, and when do they leave, just by looking at all of that. Now, another reason why I'm using this neighborhood is because it's known as a Jewish quarter. It's the north part of a quarter named Le Marais, which is a famous Jewish quarter in France. And there you had many Jews who came from Eastern Europe and from Poland between the end of the 19th centuries and the late 1930s. In fact, sorry, I missed that, but this is one example of the archives, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. In fact, this is a map of all of the people who have been deported from Paris. So each dot represents someone deported from Paris, and with that you can get a sense of how the Jewish population was distributed throughout space in Paris. And so the two neighborhoods I'm studying are here, and you have a big Jewish population in the 18th arrondissement over there. You have Le Marais over the 3rd and the 4th, which is around here. You have the 11th and Belleville over there, and you have the 10th arrondissement over there. All of these are big spots for Jewish populations, and you can see that the neighborhoods I'm looking at are kind of in the middle of all of that. In fact, about 5% of all of the Jews of Paris lived in those two neighborhoods that I'm studying. And overall, in these two neighborhoods, you have about 16% of the population who was Jewish, which is a lot more than for the rest of Paris, which is about 7% of the Parisian population was Jewish in 1940. In those two neighborhoods, you have about 5,500 Jews in this study area. Half of them are French, and half of them are foreigners. Now, when I say that half of them are French and have the French nationality, a lot of those French Jews are in fact, at least for those two neighborhoods, they are in fact children of foreign Jews coming from Eastern Europe. So you have a big population of Jews who came from Eastern Europe and mostly from Poland, either for their generation or the generation just before them. So how do I study those two neighborhoods? Well, part of it is using all of those archives I briefly mentioned to produce some spatial statistical analysis. I'm using GIS and quantitative methods to look at change in population, to produce maps, such as the map that you have on the screen. So these maps represent the population, the Jewish population at the very beginning of the occupation. And so each circle represents the number of households, of Jewish households for each building. But another way I'm looking I'm studying these neighborhoods, and that's the reason I'm here at the Shoah Foundation, is I'm trying to use testimonies to understand the spatial experience of the people who lived in these neighborhoods. What do survivors say about their neighborhoods? What do they say about their spatial practices? But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about how do I find testimonies of people who lived in those two quarters. If you've ever used the Visual History Archives, or you can listen to the testimonies from the Shoah Foundation, you might know that there's a pretty good indexing system. But if you look at geographical terms to find out who is speaking about where and which places, the lowest level is the city. So for instance, here I can find people who talk about Paris, and in fact there is more than 4,500 testimonies of people who speak about Paris at some point, but I cannot go deeper. Just Paris is the only term that is referred to for the entire Parisian region, which is why you have just one big dot here. That doesn't mean that people are talking about that place of Paris. They're just talking about Paris in general. And so for me, who wants to listen to testimonies of people from particular neighborhoods, that was kind of a challenge. And so I've used three ways of trying to find testimonies from these particular neighborhoods. The first one was looking for known survivors. In France, we have pretty good records of deportation. There is a scholar named Serge Clarcel who spent a good part of his life trying to make lists of all of the people who have been deported from France. He included the last known address of all of those people in some of those lists. And so there's about 1,400 people who have been deported from the two neighborhoods I'm studying. In fact, there's probably more than 1,400, but when you just use the last known address, there is 1,400 of them there. There's probably quite a few more who fled, and so their address is maybe in South France. But out of those 1,400, 50 people survived, and so I was just able to enter the name of those 50 people to see if any of them testified. And in fact, five of those 50 people have a testimony in the Visual History Archive. So those were the first 5 testimonies that I was able to find, but now I was hoping to find many more testimonies to get a bigger picture of what was happening in those neighborhoods. So the second method I tried to use to find people who lived in those neighborhoods was, since we have the names in the 1940 census that actually has been typed, I could try to enter the names of those households heads and see if any of them either talk about them or if they themselves did testify. Now, one of the issues with that is there is more than 2,000 families, and so that's a lot of names to enter. And then when you start entering those names, you realize that there is quite a few problems. First, because many people have the same name, so you might enter a name, you get a hit from the VHA, but in fact that person is from a different country, and it's just someone who has the same name as someone who lived in the neighborhood. And the other issue is that there are many misspellings in the census, and so sometimes you don't get a hit, but just because it's been misspelled in the original census. So that method of looking at names from the census didn't work as well as I was expecting. So then I started to talk with people here at the center, and I talked in particular with Crispin, who helped me devise another method to find people who testified from those two neighborhoods. And if you know a little bit about the VHA and the indexing terms, you can select countries, you can select cities, but you can also select time. And so I started to look at how many testimonies did we have of people who lived, who are talking about Paris before the war or during the war. How many people are talking about Paris in 1949? How many people are talking about Paris in 1942? And making a list of all of those people. And the idea behind it is, if they talk about Paris before the war, and especially if they talk about Paris at multiple points before and during the war, it might be because they lived in Paris at some point. And so when you look at that, I ended up with about 2,000 testimonies of people who speak about Paris before the war. And then the next step was to know, well, do those people actually lived in Paris, and if so, where did they live in Paris? Now, the good thing about the Shah Foundation is you don't have to listen to the testimonies to know where they lived. Each survivor, before they gave their testimony, they fill out a form that's called a pre-questionnaire interviews, PIQs. And so there is a lot of information on those forms, including information about their family members, including information about their job and where they spent the war. But there is a field in there that is asking, what was your pre-war address? And so in that case, in the case of the PIQ that you have in front of you, the survivor was Maurice Migdal, and he said that his pre-war address was 46 Rue Notre-Dame de Nazareth in Paris, France, which is a street that is right into one of my two neighborhoods. And so as of now, I've looked at 600 PIQs from those 2,000 that I identified, and I found 37 testimonies of people from those two neighborhoods. Now it pretty much matches the proportion of people who lived in Paris, of Jewish people who lived in Paris at that time. You have about 1 in 20 Jews who lived in those two neighborhoods, and when you look at the PIQs, about 1 in 20 PIQs, about 1 in 20 survivors who speak about Paris at that time are indeed from one of those two neighborhoods. So that's a method that works pretty well. Now I only looked at 600 PIQs. I have about 1,500 more to go, but I'm hoping to get to a total of perhaps 75 testimonies of people from one of those two neighborhoods at some point. Now this took quite a bit of time, but I've been able to listen to 12 of those testimonies already. So the question now is, so what do I do with testimonies? There is actually multiple things I can do with testimonies. This is a map of all of the 37 testimonies that I found that are from those neighborhoods. Each dot represents someone at their address. And I've listened for now mostly at people from this street, which is la Rue Notre-Dame de Nazareth. When I listened to testimonies, one of the first things I could do was comparing the information that is given in the testimony with all of the information that I was able to collect from the archives I told you about. Doing that, I can look at how they complement each other. I can try to triangulate information, try to understand the limitations of the archives, and all of that. So for instance, Marcel Jablot, who's the man here in the picture posing with his mom, Simon Jablonovich. Jablonovich was their name during the war. Marcel changed his name after the war and is now named Marcel Jablot. He was born in Paris in 1924. He was the son of a tailor from Poland, and his mom is Parisian, but her parents came from Poland in the late 1800s. He lived in 7 Boulevard Saint-Denis, so in one of these two neighborhoods. He fled to Free France in 1942. He was deported from Nice, so from the south of France, in October 43 to Auschwitz with both of his parents and with his grandmother. He was the only survivor, and he gave a testimony. And now when you listen to his testimony, you can get a sense, you can compare what he says with a lot of the archives I talked about. First, he says in his testimony that he moved Boulevard Saint-Denis, and he says that he moved in 36 or 37, but he wasn't quite sure. Well, it turns out that if you look at the census, and now I'm talking just about the general normal census that was taken in France in 1946, you can see that the Jablonich family is actually in the census here. And so he lived there already in 1936, and we do know that he lived there, that he moved there with his family in 36 or before. He lived there with his dad, with his mom, and we also can see that he had a maid, which kind of gives you, so this here says maid, and that kind of gives you an idea of what type of family it was and who they were interacting with. Then he talks about having to register in 1940 on the census, and we have traces of that in the census. Then he speaks about wearing the yellow star to school for a few days before he fled to South France, and we also have traces of that. The image that you have on the screen is the register of the people who came and picked up their star, and here in the middle you can see that Marcel Jablonovich, Simon Jablonovich, and Joseph Jablonovich all came and picked up their star. They had to sign when they did, so you have their address here. This is the number on their ID cards, and then you still have information about when they were born and where they were born. And then if you look at the deportation list, you also have the 4 Jablonovich. So here, his mom, his dad, and his grandmother, and himself, all are listed as being deported. And in fact, there is another list, the list I was talking about, which also lists an address. And so we do know that they were deported from Nice, which matches pretty well what he's saying in his testimony. So in that case, the testimony and the archives all match. And that's actually pretty fascinating to see that, to find all of this information in the archives and to have that repeated in the testimony and to see that it matches pretty well. Now, it doesn't always match very well. Sometimes the testimonies do not perfectly align with the archives. So in the case of the Stolak family, which they had 4 kids, and 2 of the sisters, Marjem here and Sarah here, they both survived and they both gave testimonies in the VHA. The family lived in Rue Notre-Dame de Nazareth, and they tell us that their brother Jacob and their mother Brajna were arrested while trying to cross the demarcation line, and that's an information that is not specified in the list of the deportees. We know that their mother and brother have been deported, but we do not know from where. And here the testimony is something that brings additional information that helps us see that they started to flee and that they were deported. Their little sister was not deported, but the 2 testimonies that the 2 sisters give are not, they don't perfectly match. We don't exactly know how she managed to survive. Now, another issue that happens when you compare the archives and the testimonies, looking at the Stolak family, is that in 1942, when they go pick up their star, there is actually another child that is on the list. His name is Léon Stolak. He was born in 1943, and clearly he was living at their place in 1942. All of them were picking up the star at the same time. They all have the same address, and they all sign at the same time. But when we listen to the testimonies, there is no sign of that child. And so in other archives, he's listed at a different address. So maybe the cousin who was with them at the time. But here really, you have some some information that is unclear in the archives, and in that case, the testimony do not help understand really what's going on in there. So overall, comparing testimonies and archives is very valuable, and when possible, it helps completing the archival information with the testimonies, and that's the first way I've been using testimonies. Another way I've been using testimonies is to compare what is said by survivors with the results of quantitative analysis. For instance, what type of neighborhood are we talking about? I've said that quantitative analysis helps you say that about 15% of the neighborhood is Jewish, but is this a Jewish neighborhood? This map, for instance, shows for each building what is the percentage of Jewish households. And so you can see that there are Jewish households in pretty much all of the buildings, or at least in most of the buildings, but that the percentage here is not very, very high. It's rarely above 25%. Surely there is quite a few Jewish people in there, but it's not the majority. Now that means that Jews and non-Jews are living in the same streets, they're living in the same buildings, but here we don't, this map doesn't tell you how much do they interact and do they interact. So listening to testimonies here help us answer those questions. So I pulled up a few quotes from testimonies who kind of give you a sense of what that neighborhood was like, and how we can compare that to the quantitative results that I just provided. First, Michel Kuna said that it's not entirely a Jewish neighborhood, but in part because there was, first of all, a synagogue in the street, Notre-Dame de Nazareth, and several stores with Eastern European food. And Irene Robinson says something pretty much similar. She said, I lived in the 3rd arrondissement, which is a Jewish neighborhood. I mean, not completely, but certainly to some degree, right next to Le Carreau du Temple, which was a big market where most of the sellers, most of the people who did business there were Jews. And so here you can already sort of get a sense that that this neighborhood is perceived by the Jews themselves as being very Jewish, not necessarily because there is a majority of Jewish people, because in fact there is not a majority of Jewish people, but you have other signs in the landscape that give you that impression of or that perception of a very Jewish neighborhood. You have the synagogue, you have a lot of Jewish stores, and so all of that sort of helps framing the neighborhood as particularly Jewish. If you look at what Sarah Vieille said, she said, I live surrounded only by Jews in the street Notre-Dame de Nazareth. There was a lot of them. They were going out together. I only spent time with Polish Jewish people. In the street, there were several Jewish grocery stores. And so here, once again, you can see that the idea that it's a very Jewish neighborhood with a lot of Jewish grocery stores, with a lot of Jewish people. But now, if she said I was surrounded only by Jews, and if you look at the data, actually she had quite a few neighbors who were not Jewish. But you can see that, at least from her testimony, Jews and non-Jews did not mix that much. She said that she only spent time with Polish Jewish people. It kind of gives you an idea of how the two populations mix. Now I'd like to nuance that quote, because when you look at the rest of the testimony, of her testimony, she's actually mentioning quite a few non-Jewish people that she sees frequently. She has one friend at school who's non-Jewish. She mentions her non-Jewish concierge who lives in the same building. She mentions people at non-Jewish grocery stores with whom she does black market. And then she says that she has repeated contacts, or her family has repeated contacts with one French policeman that they paid to have information, at least to some point during the war, to sort of know what's going on. And so here you see that, of course, in this neighborhood, where there is a big Jewish population, Jewish people tend to spend a lot of time together, but they also interact to some degree with a lot of non-Jewish people. So that was the second way that I wanted to mention in how I've been using testimonies to to kind of compare what you can find from the archives when you study them in a quantitative way, and also what you can get from the testimonies and see if it matches and how you can illustrate one with the other. Now, a third way I've been using testimonies is to look at what they say, what the survivors say about their spatial experience, what they say about their perception and their feeling. And I'm only beginning to work on that aspect because I've looked at only 12 testimonies, which is not that many. But I want to spend some time sharing two big elements, two big questions that I came up with. First, I want to speak about the effect of the yellow star on spatial experience. On May 1942, all of the Jews older than 6 are forced to wear the yellow star in public in Paris. And many survivors talk about the star as a turning point in the persecution process and a turning point about how they feel about the persecution. Marjem Stolak, for instance, she says, "This was a shock for us to go in the streets wearing this yellow star. We're not like everybody. We were a different kind of people," I realized. And from that quote, you can already pick up two things. First, that the Jewish star for many Jews actually, and for kids, but not only for kids, is really, as soon as they have to wear that star, that's when they realize that they have to wear that Jewish identity on them at all time. And for people who were not particularly feeling Jewish, that's when they realize that they are different or that they are treated differently than other people. The other element of that quote that is important is that she mentions the streets, and really that shows that wearing this star out in public changes the way she perceives the streets, changes the way she's perceived when she is out there in public. In fact, the Jewish star is making explicit the presence of Jews in the street, and it really differentiates them from non-Jews. The Jews can no longer pass as non-Jews, and their identity is written directly on Jewish bodies. Now, another effect, an effect of that star is that it helps enforce anti-Jewish measures. And in February 1942, for instance, Jews are subject to curfew between 8 p.m. and 6 p.m. And then slowly Jews are excluded from all public establishments, from all public spaces, from cafes, from gardens, from libraries, and therefore from most public social activities. And really, the star is what allows the police to enforce that, because you can readily, just by looking at someone, know if they are Jew or if they're not. And so that's somewhat what Marjem Stolak says when she says, "I think we managed to go out because we removed the star to go to the theater, to go to the movies, but we were not allowed. The police was checking the place. We managed still from time to time." And here it points to how people, how Jewish people reacted to the star, how they dealt with the star. And in fact, you have many different ways that Jews react to the star. Some refuse to put it on, which of course put them at risk, which is exactly what Marjem Stolak is saying. When she doesn't wear the star, it allows her greater freedom to be in the street, but it also puts her at risk, because if she is discovered, if it is discovered that she is Jewish and that she doesn't wear the star, well, then she might be arrested and deported. Other people wore the star with pride. Michel Kuna and other survivors said that he wears it a few days before it is being made mandatory. He does that mostly to show that he's not afraid of it. And you also have quite a few survivors who explain that they did wear the star just to follow the rules, in the hope that it would somewhat protect them, just to make sure they were not out of the law. In any cases, though, it makes a deep impact on their lives and on the way they experience public space. Either they wear it, and so it prevents them to go in public space, and when they do, when they are allowed to do so, it makes it clear to everybody else that they are Jew, and so then they cannot escape their Jewish condition in the street. And they had to follow all of these restrictions I talked about. Or the other option was to not wear the star, but in that case, you are being put at risk of being discovered. And that brings us to another set of questions that is related to safety. And in that case, I want to talk a little bit about safety and home and the address and how all of that interact with each other. So I pulled up a few quotes from Irene Robinson, who said, "One night, 3 or 4 Germans came in our home, poking their bayonets, yelling in German. I was so terrified, they poked around and left us in this state of an unbelievable violation. I felt the adults were incapable of protecting me." And so in that instance, the Germans just came in and checked quite a few things, but they actually did not arrest anyone. And yet you can see already that there is that question of violation, that question that she does not feel safe at home anymore. And in fact, many, if not most, of the arrests in Paris happened at home. And so that ties it back to that question of the archives I had earlier, just because the police knows the address of most of the Jews because of what is in the archives, because of all of these lists they've been able to produce. And that's why most of the arrests happen at home. And so that question of the address is very important. If the police knows your address, then you know that you're not safe anymore. For instance, Maurice Migdal, he says in his testimony that he happened to be safe from one arrest, from one of the early arrests where the police was actually not coming directly at home, but sending notes at home, convocation, asking people to go to the police station. And it turned out that Maurice Migdal he changed his address between the moment where he went to declare himself and the moment of that arrest. And so he never received that note that was supposed to ask him to go get deported. And so here, changing the address provides some type of safety. The second quote of Irene Robinson that's on the screen and said, I can't see, she said, "I knew I was going to a safe place. I really wanted to go there." And she says that at the moment where her mom sends her out of Paris to the countryside, and the interviewer is asking, "How do you feel leaving your home?" And that's what she answers. "I knew I was going to a safe place. I really wanted to go there." And once again, it shows how home is not considered safe by the Jews at that time in many cases. And in fact, that there is a very complex relationship between home and safety, or at least perception of safety at that time. It's very hard for them to know which places are safe, and most importantly, who is safe. There is a constant and evolving understanding of safety. At first, people believe that men are going to be the only one who will be arrested, and that women and children are probably safe. There is the idea that French nationals will not be arrested, and only non-French Jews will be arrested. Sometimes there is the idea that veterans' family and families of prisoners of wars will not be arrested even though they are Jewish. And this kind of evolves throughout the period. What becomes apparent, though, is that no one is really safe. Sure, at first it's only the men, and it's mostly the non-French Jews who are being arrested, but that changes, especially because the people are trying to react and to protect themselves from those potential arrests. And so the people who are thought to not be safe, for instance, the men, they would be the first one to leave home and to go into hiding. So the Jews adopt here a lot of different spatial strategies to put the people who they think are not safe, to put them in safety. And this often leads to family separations. It leads to the destruction of the household. It leads to making home even less safe. Different categories leave or go into hiding at different times, oftentimes leaving part of the family behind, sometimes with the hope that they will be able to join later. For the men, it's thought at the beginning that it's safer to leave, even if you don't have a plan, even if you don't know where you're going. But just home is becoming so unsafe that that leaving is really the only safe thing to do. And then women and children, it might be better for them to stay home just because of that uncertainty of where they might be going. And with the hope that later on, when the when men find jobs and when they find a place to stay in the countryside or in South France, they might be able to reconnect with their family. In fact, it's not always, sometimes it happens that way, but in many cases, because the men are not home, women and children have been arrested in their stead. You also have a lot of Jews who were able to flee to some degrees, but who are being arrested later on in South France or later on in the countryside, or even being arrested on the way to flee. And overall, it seems that there is very few Jews who manage to stay at home and survive. Now, it doesn't mean that leaving was much, much better, because, as I said, a lot of people have been arrested while leaving. So there's that question of home and safety, and how that relates to the address, and how that relates to how the police might know your address, are, I think, some points that I want to keep questioning and listening to more testimonies to understand really what's going on there, and to start conceptualizing how persecution kind of destroys the homes, destroys the household by making it less safe. Now, before I completely conclude, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a different issue, which is not directly related to what I've been talking about before. In fact, it's something that I did not think I was going to do, but that I did during my stay here. So I mentioned that I've looked at 600 testimonies, 600 PIQs of people who most likely lived in Paris. And from those PIQs, I took out the addresses and to start to look at where are survivors living in Paris. And so what this map shows is for 400 people where we know their address and we know they lived in Paris before, just before the war. I put a dot on that map. And so I want to talk a little bit about how those type of maps can be used, and so how we can reuse the PIQs to engage people with testimonies. I think there is 3 big ways we can use this type of maps. Of course, it's not complete, right? I would like to put all of the dots for all of the Jews who lived in Paris and gave a testimony. I'll keep working on it, but for now there is 400, which is a different number. So one of the way we can use that map is by comparing how the Jewish population is in space, or how the survivors are in space, and with other type of maps that are similar. For instance, comparing that map with the map of deportees, or comparing that map with a map of the people who lost their home, and try to see if there are places, if there are spaces in Paris where you find more survivors than you would expect, or if the places where people lose their home are also the places where survivors give testimonies, trying to get a sense of if there are places where you have more survivors and things like that. Another way I think that this map can be helpful is for other people who study Paris and who are also focusing on different neighborhoods, and so they can just, instead of doing the work I've done, just use those maps to figure out testimonies of people who live in the neighborhoods they want to study. And I think a third way to use that map, which is perhaps one of the most important, is for school and for the general public, finding testimonies of people from their building, from their neighborhood, or from their street, something that they can really relate to. Might be much easier, especially for kids. For instance, it's easier to, or maybe it's not easier, but it's more engaging to listen to a testimony of someone who's from your street, rather than just to listen to a testimony of someone who's from Paris in general. And so I think this map, when I finish it, can be used in this way in order to engage the public, to engage children, and to help people find testimonies that might appeal to them much faster. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say regarding all that. And so I guess we'll open the floor for questions. I don't know, Martha.
Maël, thank you so much. Again, if we were all together in person, we would all be clapping. Yes, so now we'll start the discussion section. So there are two ways for the participants to let us know that they have questions so that we can call on you. The first way is down in the Zoom bar to click, if you're using the application, you click on the participants button and you will see the raise hand icon all the way on the left-hand side. So you can click that you click participants and then click raise hand, and you can raise your hand to ask a question, or you could just type in the chat that you have a question. You click on the chat button and type that you have a question and we can unmute you. All right, I'm going to unmute. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you for that talk. My question is about the software or what you're using to do this plotting. My project is also kind of, as it is developing, is going to be about Berlin and sort of looking at the urban landscape. So what kind of software did you use to do the plotting on the maps that we see on the slides?
So in that case, so I use QGIS as a software a lot to do many of those maps, but I've been also using a software called R. So I'll explain very briefly how that works when you're trying to make a map like that. I'm starting with addresses, right? And the idea is to convert the addresses to coordinates, just to be able to put the dot on the map. And so you could do that by hand if you want to, but when you have a lot of dots, you don't really want to do that by hand. And the process of converting this address to a point is called geocoding. And there is quite a few softwares that you can use. QGIS does that. You have some plugins that you can use to convert addresses to coordinates and then plot those coordinates. R has some plugins that can help you do that too. In fact, there is a service by the French government that has a pretty good images of the streets, and so you can through the software you can send the addresses and they send you back the coordinates, briefly explained. So yes.
Any other questions? Maël, can I ask you a question? Well, so this mapping, first of all, thank you for a fascinating lecture. And I'm very intrigued by the description of what it felt like to go into the streets, that excerpt that you described. And that quote talks about the shock of being in the street and the kind of possible links to embodied reactions, spatial, I don't know if spatial embodiment is a thing, or embodied reactions to spatial experiences. I want to ask you a question about this map that is on the screen now. Are the interviews that, for the PIQs that you've looked at, are most of the people that you have found, well, actually, no. So you've looked at 600 PIQs and you've mapped a bunch of the addresses. Right. So are the interviewees, do they still live in Paris? Can you tell from the PIQ? You must.
A lot of them do not. And I did not look into that too much, but at least from the few testimonies that I looked at, they always tell you where they are when they do the interview. And in fact, I think a lot of them migrated. You have some from Canada, you have some from the United States, you have some in Paris, but even the one who lived in Paris, they seem to be living on the suburb of Paris. I think a lot of them moved, and they definitely don't live where they were living at the time. But it's also due probably to some degree to the fact that a lot of them were children, right? And so they moved after that.
Yeah.
And just a brief thing. So you mentioned, the embodiment in the street. What does it do? Actually, I've been working on that a little bit from diaries, and so I'm working on a paper, and so hopefully at some point we'll have something out there. The store is a big thing, but Jewish shop owners had to put signs on their windows, and that's also something that changed the way you see the street, because suddenly you have a bunch of yellow signs that say that those stores were owned by Jews, and then those get replaced by red signs because the store have to be taken over by French people, and sometimes they close, and so that's another way it changes the streets. And it something that they say both for the store and for the signs is that not everybody is affected the same way, because if you own a kosher shop and you have to put a sign that says you're Jewish, well, it doesn't change much, because of course you're Jewish. Everybody knows you're Jewish. Now, if you own a shop that I don't know is a library and that is not already identified as Jewish, it does change a lot. And so you have that difference, and it's the same. Some streets are already identified as very Jewish, and so putting signs doesn't change much. For people who are not putting their Jewish identity up, that's when it changes a lot.
Okay, Svetlana.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I did something maybe like just a part of what you did for Odessa in Ukraine, and I also used PIQ to find the addresses where people lived before the war. And I also found some testimonies where people said that, oh, we had a completely Jewish neighborhood. We were surrounded completely by Jews before the war. I did not meet any Russian or Ukrainian people, but statistics is different. How do you explain that phenomenon?
Well, I think it's a bit early for me to fully explain that, but from what I picked up, it seems that they say that because their friend and the people with whom they spend a lot of time are in fact Jewish, right? There is in some of these testimonies, they talk a lot about going to other people's house to play cards, going to the cafe together. Just the people with whom they interact very closely seem to be Jews. But it also seems that they interact frequently with non-Jewish people. But what's interesting is these non-Jewish people, they often are able to pinpoint them, right? You have the one concierge, you have the one friend, you have the one policeman who helped them. But it seems to be just a few of these people that they interact with.
Right, thank you. And they all spoke French, because for Odessa it's maybe different in language as well. So you may not speak Russian, you may speak Yiddish only, but for Paris it's only French.
No, so you're right. Especially in this neighborhood, a lot of people spoke Yiddish, especially the parents. The kids, they pretty much all speak French. But when you listen to the testimonies, this is definitely something to take into account. They say over and over that when people are only able to speak Yiddish, it makes things more difficult for their everyday life, but it makes things even more difficult later on because they are not able to pass as non-Jew because they speak only Yiddish. And so quite clearly, even if when they speak French and they have an accent, that's a way they are easily identified as Jew, regardless of whether they have the star or not.
Thank you.
Sebastian?
Yes, hello. Thank you, first of all, for the interesting presentation. I'm from the Austrian service abroad, and as I'm going to the Fondation pour la mémoire de la déportation in Paris in September, my question would be, did you work with big archives in Paris, or did you have full access to these archives in Paris?
So, so the archives I presented, the one I said are unique, they are at the archives of the police of Paris, and this is, at least up until now, you don't need special permission. Now, what you need to know is exactly where they are, because they don't necessarily make it easy for you to access. They don't necessarily advertise them a lot. But those for this neighborhood, it's wide open. I'm also using a lot of archives that are not particularly tied to the persecution. I talked about the census of 1946, which is just a regular census. You have the same one in 46. And those are also just widely open to the public. Now, I've heard that it's becoming somewhat more difficult sometimes to get the archives. Mostly it's because they're trying to enforce a 50-year, so you're not supposed to look at any personal data that is less than 50 years old. And those archives are often mixed with other. For instance, when you look at the records of who lived where, at some point you're starting to get information about people who lived in Paris in the 70s. And if it's on the same sheet of paper, it makes it more difficult to access. But no, overall, it's been fairly easy to look at all of these archives. And if you go to the La Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah, you have access to digital copies of everything that has been kept. Now, it's not everything, but all of the cards that were used for deportation, for people who were actually deported, those you can have access to them digitally.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Wolf.
Yeah, hi, Maël. Thank you for this very interesting talk. In the beginning, you made a comment and says there were no ghettos in Paris. So from a comparative perspective, we know that in many cities in Germany, in Vienna, in Prague, and also in Budapest, there were no ghettos in the sense like in Poland, but there was the concentration of Jews via the creation of so-called Jews houses. That means apartment buildings which were owned by Jews, and Jews had to move in as families, often several families into one apartment. And so my question is, was there something similar happening over time in Paris, or was there just not enough time because deportation started early?
So no, and I'm a little bit familiar with Budapest, and so I see what you're saying. But this really did not happen in France. No, I'm definitely not able to tell you why it did not happen. But this is clearly not something that's been put into place. Now, what happened is they put more and more restriction into moving, because once the police knew where the people were, they wanted them to stay put in place, and so moving was forbidden. In some cases, people were put into specific places in the countryside because they could not go back to Paris. But there is no concentration, and there is no systematic moving of Jewish people in specific houses or in specifically designated area. Yeah.
And can I have just a follow-up question? Yeah. So you mentioned the change of spaces and also experience of space via the kind of when they the Jews had to wear the yellow star. Do you have maybe some other examples? So Tim Cole, for example, in his work on Budapest, talks about how the whole topography of the city changes for the Jews because certain markets are only accessible kind of more for them, so they have to go larger kind of across larger distances to get to certain spaces allowed for Jews. Is something similar? Did you witness something similar from the testimonies in Paris?
So what I saw in different ways of, I think, the city change is, first of all, because all of the Jewish stores were either closed or sold back, and so some specific markets were very Jewish became pretty much no one was there anymore. A lot of flea markets that happened. Now, I think and this is not something I know already. I need to keep looking at the testimonies. But what is interesting is, in theory, the Jews were supposed to be out in the street at some very specific time. And so I'm wondering if that changes the streets at those specific times where this is the only time where Jews are able to be out. But I haven't heard about that quite yet, no.
Are there any other questions? Anyone want to type something into the chat or raise your hand by clicking on the participants button and then raising your hand? Jacob?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm coming all the way from Denmark, so nice to be among you guys, and thank you for a wonderful lecture. Well, my question, if you can call it a question, is we did something similar here at the University of Southern Denmark. We did a study on the Danish Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt. Some would call it a ghetto, some would call it a city for the Jews, but let's just call it a ghetto as it was. What we did was we looked at the testimony from those Danish Jews who were sent there, and looked at how they, in their testimonies, how they dealt with where they lived, different places in the ghetto, where they found places of freedom, not many of those, places of fear, places of black market business, not many testimonies deal with that, and also where they got some health care and where they could get food. In your study, do you also did you have some categories of the different types of testimony or different themes within the testimonies?
So not quite yet, because it's the beginning. I've been here just for a month, and so all of that is still falling into place. But yes, that's definitely something I want to look at. And actually, I'd be very interested to see what you guys have found, and how that might differ when it's in a ghetto and when it's in their like home neighborhood. How does that change things?
Yeah. If I can just follow up on it, what is so special is that the Danish Jews, most of the major part of them were helped to neutral Sweden, but those who did not get away, they were for the most part sent to Theresienstadt in the Czech Republic now. And what I'm going to do is in the chat, I'm just going to write the web address so you can have a look at our website. And we also did it in QGIS. I don't think we used coordinates. I think we just used the buildings because it's such a small area. If you haven't been to Theresienstadt, it is a city within walls, so it's easily I'm going to say overlooked. Not overlooked, but you can have a good overview of just one map.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for a good lecture.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I'm just waiting for a moment. If we were in person, I would be scanning the room. So instead, I'm scrolling down the chat to see if anyone is typing anything. Well, before I thank Maël and take you all off mute so you also can thank him, we can thank him collectively, I want to thank our co-sponsor for the lecture, the USC Francophone Research and Resource Center. We appreciate your partnership and support and promotion of the event, so thank you so much. And now I'm going to take everybody off mute so you can join me in thanking Maël. I'll do it first because I don't know what's going to happen when I take everyone off mute. So Maël, thank you so much for the lecture and for this month of research, which really shows the potential of working with the pre-interview questionnaires, which are digitized and available for access at our center. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to take everybody off mute so we can all say thank you together. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maël.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just can't believe that for like the not the third year, but like not counting spring break, like for the last 3 years I've done nothing for spring break. Nothing. Last year I did nothing.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our online event, and thank you.
Thank you.